People should know how their bodies work. People should know how consent works. And people should never be ashamed about having sex. I'm a sex worker, and that's a key part of who I am. I've been working as a sex worker for more than 20 years. I'm from New Zealand originally. I've worked in decriminalised environments, but I've worked in criminalisation as well. And now I'm working in Victoria, which has a licensing environment. I'm queer. I originally came from a small country town, and I think that has really affected me. I come from quite a religious background, and that's definitely affected me as a person. Being raised in the church and rejecting the church, or realising the church rejected every part of who I am, growing apart from my family because of their views of who I am as a person, and growing into what I call logical family, which is queer and sex worker community, who have been tremendous support through my life, and I don't think I'd be alive if I didn't have that. And being diagnosed with Asperger's when I was in my early 30s, which explained a lot about me as a person, which was tremendously helpful. So, yeah, that's me. The key thing that you'll hear talked about a lot is that sex workers want the full criminalisation of our work. And it isn't that that's some magic panacea and it's going to fix everything, but it's a necessary first step for us in recognising our human rights and our labour rights and recognising sex work as work. And I think the key thing with any marginalised community is that we want to be listened to and have our voices heard. And sex workers have been asking for the full criminalisation of our work for a very long time. And our representative organisations have been asking for a very long time. In criminalised environments, you just don't have the ability, when something goes wrong in your work, when you're subject to a violent crime, when you're subject to a sexual assault, to have the same access to police. And even in licensing environments like we have here in Victoria, you don't have the same access to go to the police when something goes wrong. For example, here in Victoria, street-based sex work is still criminalised, and people that don't work in compliance with the licensing system. So if you aren't following every little rule about how you can work, where you can work, who you can work with, and how you're doing your work, then you're not in compliance. Now, if you're in that position and you're sexually assaulted and you call the police, they can charge you for not being in compliance with the law, or they can charge you if you're a street-based sex worker when you report a sexual assault. Now, nobody should ever be put in that position. Nobody should ever think, if they're subject to a sexual assault, is it safe for me to call the police? Are they going to charge me with a crime when I'm trying to report my rapist? That's an appalling position to put someone in. And we have New Zealand, which brought in decriminalisation in 2003. And we have New South Wales, which brought it in 1995. And we have studies over time that show that it does support our human rights and it does make it safer and it does support our health. And so there's no excuse. The key thing is that people seem to forget that human rights are just that, they're human rights. You don't need to qualify for them. You get them because you're human. And when people are denied their human rights, then essentially you're being told that you're not human. We had a big win last year. There were 2 cases that came through the Victorian courts that related to sexual assaults of sex workers. And the judges that presided over those cases gave the offenders that sexually assaulted the sex workers reduced sentences based on the fact that sex workers aren't affected by sexual assault in the same way that a chaste woman would be. The Victorian court at the time and the Judicial College of Victoria wrote it in as part of the guidelines for the Victorian Sentencing Manual for Judges, that this could be taken into consideration and used in other cases. Now, that stayed as part of the Victorian sentencing guidelines for judges for 36 years. And it took until last October to have that overturned. At a panel, someone asked me from the audience what the definition of a chaste woman was under Victorian law. After the panel finished, a lawyer that was in the audience came up and said, no, there is actually a definition of a chaste woman under Victorian law. The definition actually disadvantages all victims of sexual assault in Victoria. The definition is a suburban housewife at home doing the vacuuming who is assaulted by a complete stranger that has broken into her home. And the prejudices that are enshrined in law and in guidelines like that disadvantage survivors of sexual assault in the courts. And a lot of the issues that we face as sex workers with our community affect all survivors of sexual assault. And the law reform we need to work on together. I think victim blaming's a really complex thing for sex workers. The idea that we're doing something dangerous so it's our fault. And people almost sort of treat sexual assault and sex work like it's some sort of occupational hazard that we should be expecting. Sexual assault's not acceptable in any workplace. It's certainly not acceptable in mine. People want to distance themselves from sexual assault. They don't want to think it can happen to them. In a sense, it's a natural reaction. They want to rationalise all the ways that they could have avoided that. But they do that by blaming you. Because sex workers are both stigmatised and also silenced to talk about the reality of sex worker community. And for example, in Australia, more than 60% of sex workers identify as LGBTIQ. When people don't hear our voices, they don't hear about our stories and our lived experience, and they don't see the reality of our lives, then the policy that government makes isn't based on fact, on evidence, on what's actually happening in our community. People that want to have conversations about criminalising sex work but don't want to involve sex workers in those conversations. The idea that you're going to talk about a group of people that are disempowered and disempower them more by not involving them in the discussion is horrifying. And yet that's what anti-sex work groups do all the time. They often do it more persistently to the most marginalised parts of sex worker community. Sex workers of colour, trans sex workers, the most marginalised members of our community are marginalised most by being silenced. There have been a number of closets I've stepped out of over the years. And I made a choice a few years ago to be out as a sex worker, to be out as queer and to be out to everyone. That's not an easy thing because people obviously make a lot of judgments. And people walked away from me, like the people I'd known all my life, never spoke to me again. But the people that stayed in my life were the people I could count on. The freedom I had after that of being able to do what I wanted, when I wanted, on my terms, and not having to lie about it. Yeah. That counted being free. I've learned a lot, but I'm still learning, and I think I always will be. And I hope I always will be. I'd like to think that I'm always open to learning more. I think all of us should be. Because if you're not, then you've stopped listening. We should always be listening.